before I open up for questions and comments which will relate to our discussion, I would like to come up with one question which if you could respond. It's quite clearly, I think globally as well, that the call for the process for peace is in the Middle East to be continued, and over the past decades, I think there's a lot of discussions. What would be the solution? Is it a one-state solution? Is it a two-state solution? What is quite clear from your earlier points that which you've made is that the struggle from the Palestinians must continue for a long run, and Hamas plays a central role to that. So within this situation, and what do you see about this contesting suggestions which has been put forward by the various global communities? Some are talking about two-state solution, one solution. How do you see this?
Well, these various proposals came at different times, and I mean, I still remember when Edward Said was talking about a one-state solution. Probably if Edward Said were still alive today, he'd probably just drop it, because so much has changed. Yasser Arafat, who went into Oslo thinking that that was going to produce a two-state solution, was dealing with a situation that no longer existed. He himself came to that conclusion in 2000 after returning from Camp David and the meeting with Ehud Barak, Ehud Barak failed during the Clinton, the very last few days of the Clinton administration. Today, the reality in Palestine is that no land is left for a Palestinian state to exist. So probably in 1992 or 1991, when the Madrid conference was organized and was the first conference in modern time to bring the Arabs and the Israelis together, and even representatives of the PLO, the two-state solution seemed to some people realistic. Shimon Peres and Ishaq Rabin might have thought that was inevitable. But then the Zionists, the extremist Zionists in Israel took over, and is represented by the current government, and they enhanced settlement activities, confiscated more Palestinian land, and left the Palestinians with nothing really. And that's why when I proposed in a chapter in my book the idea of a long-term truce, there was still enough land to do this if the Israelis wanted to do it. That is, to enter into a deal with Hamas based not on de jure recognition but on a de facto recognition. But today even this long-term truce doesn't apply because there is no land. Today what Netanyahu and the people around him believe in is a one-state solution for the Jews. The Palestinians don't exist, they don't want them, and that's why one of the rumors that have been circulated recently is that Trump's deal of the century talks about a potential Palestinian state in Gaza and part of Sinai. In other words, the West Bank is gone. For Netanyahu and his government, the West Bank is not negotiable. Now, Hamas' point of view is that, or at least it used to be, when they had a clearer vision of what they wanted, is that all of this does not concern us. Does not concern us because our struggle is a long-term struggle for the liberation of the whole of Palestine, the undoing of Zionism. Because if you think about it, Zionism is just another form of apartheid. You cannot live in any country in the world if it is based on apartheid, because you'll have superhumans and inferior humans. How can you have a country like this? How can you have a society like this? So I think today, all these discussions about whether it is one-state solution or two-state solutions are totally irrelevant.
Well, I think this is a very sticky issue because, I think a few times, the Palestinian ambassador in Malaysia gave a talk, and and one of the questions that I posed to him was that, I mean, in his view, what is the solution that he really wanted? Was it like what you said, a single state or a two-state solution, or whether he wanted to drive the Jews into the Red Sea or something like that? So I don't know. I think it's a real Palestinian issue, and it's an issue for all of us, Muslims all around the world. And I think that could you come up with a more concrete, how do I say, solution to this problem?
Well, the solution I suggest in my book begins with where the South Africans ended. That this is not about driving the Jews anywhere. We don't need to drive anybody anywhere. But we need to establish the fact and recognize and acknowledge the fact that Zionism is anti-human. If we agree, all of us in Palestine, Jews and Arabs, Muslims, Christians and Jews, that Zionism is not the future and cannot be the future, this is like the South Africans agreed among themselves that apartheid has to come to an end. This should be the starting point. Then we can talk. Any talk before that, allowing Zionism to exist as an ideology and as a political project, is a non-starter. Because from the Zionist point of view, they are superior human beings and we are inferior human beings. They are entitled to the land and we are temporarily on the land. I mean, my ancestors have been on this land for thousands of years. How come that suddenly these Eastern European Jews, followed afterwards by Jews from other places, claim a divine right to the land, exclusive to them, as if God was a real estate agent? That has to come to an end. That cannot continue. So I think that's the starting point. Had Yasser Arafat not signed Oslo until he obtained that acknowledgement from them, probably the world would have been completely different today. But then look at the hypocrisy of the world. Hypocrisy of the United Nations, the hypocrisy of the European Union, the hypocrisy of all those who recognize the legitimacy of Israel. They recognize the legitimacy of a colonial project while denying the original inhabitants, the victims of this colonial project, their basic human rights. So even if we just talk about human rights, nothing else, Zionism is a major violator of human dignity and human rights. And once in a closed meeting that brought me to some very senior Israeli former and current officials, I said this to them. I said to them, don't ask me about the future until you agree with me that first we have to undo Zionism. Well, they didn't have an answer because it's difficult for them because they legitimize themselves in the name of Zionism. And Zionism is the sister of fascism and Nazism. It's exactly the same ideology. I mean, show me one country in the world where if you are a follower of a certain religion, by constitution, by law, then you are superior and you can take anybody else's land and do to them whatever you want, just because you happen to be the follower of that religion. And the funny thing here is that the founding fathers of Zionism were irreligious, were actually anti-religion. Israel Shahak explains this very well in his book, Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. As I said, John Rose, Ellen Pape, all these great writers, I mean, they agree with this analysis that the problem is with an ideology that denies the other their humanity.
Propose for a political settlement in this issue rather than military engagement? Because it seems that, to me, for one Israeli soldier that you kill, they kill 10 Palestinians. So would that be appropriate? No, their response has been what they call disproportionate response. And I think that was detrimental to the Palestinians.
People whose countries are invaded and whose land is occupied first resort to normal appeals. Please give me my land back. Please don't do this to my family. Please don't destroy my house. But then, if you kill my children, if you destroy my house, if you imprison me and torture me, if you leave me no room to breathe, then you drive me to resort to other means of hopefully making you realize that I exist. This is where armed struggle comes from. Armed struggle is not, war in general, is not something that people like to be involved in. Even the Quran describes the war as something that is disliked, that is hated. But when it is imposed on you, when you have an invading army, you are not expected to just say, oh, well, I'm not a person who is willing to use violence against violence. It's a human nature. And this is where the idea of long-term truce comes from. When the Israeli officers went to see Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, as I mentioned earlier, in his prison cell in April 1994, they asked him, Sheikh Yassin, we want to stop this killing, how do we do it? This was in response to the first series of martyrdom operations. And he said to them, stop killing us, we'll stop killing you. Very simple. So armed struggle is not something that you resort to because you love to. It would be preferable if the world recognizes that you are a victim and gives you back your rights without that sort of struggle.
I wanted first to say about my very amateur personal opinion. When I think about this Arab-Israeli conflict, with myself, I sometimes have different opinions. Depends on the time and the thoughts that I injected into my head. But more often I come to the conclusion that the Arabs in Palestine, they lost the struggle because they didn't fight at the moment they needed to fight or mobilize support. And I'm not talking about only Arabs in Palestine, but the others who missed the chance to support them and to support the cause, because they were overtaken by this so-called startup nation who were smarter, who were well equipped, who had very good connections, apparently, that they were able to lobby the Zionist project in the European parliaments, in particular the British one. So the moment is lost, the moment is missed. Maybe in the last century they had a chance to fight back, to mobilize support in the Arab world, and either because of the lack of this support, unwillingness of this support, due to different factors, they lost. And for now, I see the cause as already lost because, as you correctly put it, there's no land for the two-state solution anymore. And on the other hand, this startup nation has a very strong, well-entrenched, and instilled in people's mind ideology that, sometimes I read the articles by the Israeli writers and academicians, and they say, when they speak about Iran, they say, the Nazism also started the same way, a little bit of rhetoric, explaining anti-Semitism and all that. But what they themselves, what the Zionism has done, it has done the same. And I've been looking at my colleagues, my former colleagues who were migrating to Israel, because the program of migration is still on and people are migrating, and I've been seeing how the views change from very moderate ones to, like, if I post I remember I posted a picture of the rally here against, I think, capturing of Al-Aqsa, and I just posted the pictures, and all my former colleagues who now live in Israel, they started to blame me, how dare you, they're killing us day by day. And I was so surprised. I can see how people's mind change, and there's been done a lot of work that people see this cause as righteous. And frankly, I think I'm still much younger than you, but I think I lack the optimism, and I think they've lost already. And without some so-called international political will, nothing is going to change. They're going simply to be extinct over there. But I would like you to dissuade me if you have any arguments, please.
A movement that comes in waves rather than in one go yes, we lose one round, we lose the second round, but eventually there will be a chance. We must never give up. As I mentioned, the French occupied Algeria for 130 years. Eventually they left. Yes, they didn't leave it in a very good shape, but they left. The balance of power in the world, as well as in the region, is not in favor of delivering justice to the Palestinians. When the Arabs revolted, starting with Tunisia, followed by Egypt and the rest, our level of optimism suddenly was enhanced, because if the Arab peoples are liberated from dictatorship, from these corrupt despots, that is a great help to the Palestinian cause, definitely, there is no question about it. But now, because of the counter-revolution, things are even more difficult and harder than they used to be before the Arab Spring. But this is not the end of the world. This is the nature of the struggle. And freedom fighters never give up, even if they die. I mean, many freedom fighters end up giving their lives for the cause. What matters is that you believe in the cause. Because there were times when we deluded ourselves into believing that we probably can have peace with the existence of Israel, with a two-state solution, with the maintenance of Zionism. Now we feel it's been all lost because they have the upper hand. No, all that has happened is that we lost ground and we have to continue the struggle. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that eventually Palestine will be liberated and Zionism will be defeated, because Zionism is an evil ideology. And evil ideologies do not last. They cause a lot of pain to their victims, but eventually they will be defeated. The situation in the Arab world is today so bad that we are approaching the minute or the moment of another eruption. So there are people who look at the situation and find it so bad and they feel desperate. It's hopeless. There is no point in doing anything. I see it the other way around. The more difficult it gets, that means we are closer to another eruption, to another revolution. And someone will see it. I mean, we've been in this struggle in Palestine. I mean, my grandfather struggled against the English occupiers. Then my father struggled against the Zionist occupiers. I myself, I'm not in Palestine, I'm outside Palestine, but with my pen, with my lectures, with my ideas, I also struggle against Zionism. My son and my grandchildren will go on the same way. I, like my grandfather and my father before me, may never see Palestine liberated. But really what matters is for this to continue, the spirit to continue, and to be conveyed generation after generation until someone liberates Palestine.
I'm Usha Kuala from University Malaya. Okay, I have several questions. One is, in the past, Hamas and Fatah have had their differences, but I think we were all very pleased to know that last year some of those differences have been cemented. You talk about a way forward. Surely one of those ways would be to come together, because you're all Palestinian people, and it's ridiculous to have one government for the West Bank, Fatah, and one government for Gaza, which is Hamas. Wouldn't it be better to have one unified government, and then you forge your way forward, put aside some of the differences in order to come to the negotiating table, as it were? The second, that's one point, your differences with Fatah, have they been ironed out, and how do you see the way forward as a unified government in terms of negotiating for a two-state solution? Because I don't think a one-state solution is going to work unless, you correctly say, Zionism will have to be completely swept away. Then we can talk about Palestinian and the Israelis actually living together as they did centuries ago. The second is this, and very importantly, the young in Israel are very much non-Zionist, and you have a lot of support amongst young Israelis, human rights groups who are very much against the settlements that are encroaching on Palestinian land, and they are the ones who are actually standing up for the Palestinians and against their own government. This is the type of support that you need within Israel itself. Leave aside the government. Right now, even as we speak, Netanyahu, Bibi is facing, his own wars. He might even be out anytime because he's engulfed in this huge scandal of corruption. So, when we talk about Israel, we see actually a very much a changing face. We may not be dealing with that hardcore Zionist, because when we have a group of people within Israel who are willing to elect a very pro-friendly Palestinian government, that is something that gives hope for the future. And I have myself spoken when I was abroad to many Israelis who are very much pro-Palestine and are very ashamed of what their government has done. This is the type of people that we look for in the future. That's the second question, thing. The third is, of course, this huge new issue that has just erupted over Christmas last year. Trump coming up with this announcement of Jerusalem as the capital. I mean, he makes a unilateral decision like that. All he's doing is changing his embassy from one place to another place. The whole world doesn't need to follow, and quite frankly, the whole world, except for Guatemala, as we understand, is following him. But you can see very clearly from there that they don't support him. The EU doesn't support him. The rest of the world doesn't support him. They've come up against it, and the United Nations General Assembly recently, just a few months ago, have come up with this resolution completely disseminating Trump's argument. So there is a lot of support for Palestine, There is a lot of support within the United Nations itself. So these are very strong elements in Palestine's favor, and of course the future forward. So I'd like you to kindly address these 3 points, please.
If we go back 20 years or more, Fatah and Hamas were really never in agreement because they had 2 different visions. The reason Hamas came into existence is because Fatah was seen as early as 1974 giving up on Palestinian rights as many Palestinians see them. All this talk about unity, about restoring unity, comes after the election in 2006. Because what happened in 2006 is that the Palestinians thought for a minute that Oslo was dead. And that's the main reason Hamas participated in the elections of 2006. Because they thought, or they convinced themselves, that this was not like the 1996 elections based on the terms of Oslo. That is, Oslo was no longer the reference point. But it turned out that this wasn't true. That the Palestinian Authority was still intact, that Mahmoud Abbas was brought after Arafat was killed in order to resume cooperation with Israel in accordance with what was agreed upon in Oslo. Hamas misjudgment at the time that Oslo was over is one of the reasons why we have this problem today. Because the ideal situation is that Hamas and Fatah disagree, that they work separately, independently. Because you have one group that recognizes Israel and is willing to work with Israel, the other group does not recognize Israel and want to destroy Israel. So how can they meet? The delusion or the illusion that we could work together was based on the assumption that Oslo was over. And what happened in 2007 is actually the realization of the bitter reality that Oslo was not dead, and that the Americans, the Israelis, and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah were working in order to take away from Hamas the win it gained in the elections a year earlier. And that's what led to the conflict in June 2007. Since then, Hamas has always been told, if you want to be recognized, if you want people to work with you, you have to mend your ways with the Palestinian Authority. You have to reconcile. And this is where Palestinian reconciliation comes from. But it has never worked. Not a single meeting arrived at anything positive regarding reconciliation. Why? Because Palestinian Authority's frame of reference is Oslo. Hamas's frame of reference is anti-Oslo. It doesn't work. And I have always been warning about this. I talked about this in my book, I talked about this in my lectures, that you cannot bring together two individuals with completely contradictory visions of what it means to be a Palestinian, or what Palestine means to us. So this is the first question. Second question, I do, of course, recognize that Israeli society is not one and the same. Definitely, I know that. And I, of course, also commend the Israelis who want to change in the direction of recognizing Palestinian rights and living together. But I'm not sure, as you put it, that there are many of them. I think there are some, but not enough to change the political reality. I think in reality, what is happening in Israel is that more Israelis are moving to the right rather than to the left. And successive Israeli governments have made use of this by confiscating more land, by building more settlements, by expanding existing settlements. Perhaps in the future, one of the factors that might lead to a peaceful resolution of the conflict is a change within Israeli society. When more and more people realize this is not going to work. Just as happened in South Africa. When the whites realized that apartheid no longer worked and it had to come to an end. But we are still in a very early stage, and that's why people like Ellen Pape couldn't continue in Israel. He was just pushed out of academia and pushed out of the whole country because he told the truth for a change. That's why Avi Shleim cannot go to Israel anymore. He's at Oxford, although he's a prominent Israeli academic in origin. Now, what was the third point?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Look, Trump is whatever you want to describe him. Stupid, idiot, whatever. But Trump did not come to this initiative on his own. I really regret to say, and it pains me to tell you, that it is the Saudis and the Emiratis who are with him on this.
Yes.
That's the problem. We, the Arabs, have our own Zionists. Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed are Zionists. They are even worse Zionists than Trump. Trump is a businessman. He is willing to work with anybody. He'd go to bed with anybody. But Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed are staunch anti-Arabs, staunch anti-Muslims, each for his own reasons. And they I think, together with Jared Kushner, they devised this plan as a safety mechanism against a new eruption in the Arab Spring, because they wanted, for once and all, to resolve the Palestinian question so as to consolidate the Saudi, UAE, Israeli front against everybody else in the region. That doesn't necessarily mean they are going to succeed, because as you rightly said, Netanyahu has his own problems, Trump has his own problems. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he might be impeached at any time, because now every day we have new details, new information. And now the latest revelations in the New York Times the day before yesterday is that Mueller, the special counsel who is investigating Russian intervention, is now investigating UAE intervention in the White House. So it's really expanding and it's opening new things. So every one of them is in trouble and is in predicament, and that means that probably gives us some assurance that hopefully their plot will not work.
I just wanted to ask about two questions. Firstly is, once Hamas entered the political scene, how does the Qassam brigades stand? Are they autonomous from the main leadership of Hamas, or are they still under their decision, the main decisions in conducting those attacks to Israel? And secondly, I see that I was fortunate enough to be in Al-Khalil and Palestine in December, and I see a strong Turkish presence in terms of helping the community, in terms of economy and social welfare of the communities there, which looks very impoverished when I was there. So how strong is the presence of Islamic countries other than those you said, Egypt, Saudi, and all those countries in Palestine helping their cause?
Some sort of peace between Gaza and Israel. The leadership in Hamas does not believe it is in its best interest, or in the best interest of the people of Gaza, to escalate. So unless the Israelis escalate, they will not escalate. That's a political decision, that's not a military decision. But of course, you're talking here about a relatively small organization. It's big, of course, in terms of Palestinians, but in terms of universal standards, it's a small organization. So leaders of the military and people involved with the political wing and with the military wing are not completely separate. So there is it's really one body eventually. This is probably in some sense comparable to the IRA and to Sinn Féin in the Irish experience. Now the second question about the Turkish involvement. The Turks would actually love to be more involved, but they are not allowed by the Egyptians. When Turkey and Israel negotiated a resumption of relations about a year or a year and a half ago, Turkey had a plan for rescuing Gaza. They wanted to bring in a power generator, a floating power generator, to provide Gaza with its needs. The Israelis agreed. They were talking with the Israelis about the idea of a port, even discussing the possibility of an airport sometime in the future. But it was Sisi in Egypt who didn't want any Turkish involvement, because he feels Turkey is a threat to his own regime, and because Turkey supported the Muslim Brotherhood when they were in power in Egypt. So again, our real problem is actually with the Arabs, the Arab rulers, Arab despots. Those who work inside the West Bank are mainly humanitarian organizations, relief organizations from Turkey. And the Israelis usually don't have a problem with this, because Israel and Turkey have diplomatic relations and political relations, and they do purely humanitarian and educational work.
Okay, perhaps I will come up with one final question before we wrap up. A lot have been discussed and commented by our participants and also by Dr. Azzam on the situation and condition in the Middle East, mainly in Palestine, which the future, the decisions are still strongly belongs to the people who are holding power, mainly those who are the politicians, could be coming from inside Palestine or also Israel, and also within the other countries, the other global countries. But I would like to ask your own opinion on the other general Muslims globally, meaning that not to say coming from any particular parties or political parties or any leaders, but just Muslims overall in general, because it is so common that whenever there's an issue that arises, as an example, a few months back when the declaration of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was made, of course, as usual, rallies were made in globally all over the world, boycotts, campaigns on the usually associated to Israel or Zionist brands, the McDonald's, the Starbucks, and etc. But more or less, these are all the same reactions over the years since quite a number of years ago. It seems to me that the Muslims generally who supports the Palestinian cause are lacking of new way to deal or try to imagine how can we take part in the situation in a much more progressive and perhaps a more effective way. What would you suggest to generally the Muslims in the global Muslim communities who wants to support the cause, but what is still lacking in this aspect?
Well, I must remind you that support and sympathy for the Palestinians is not restricted to the Muslims. In Europe, in Britain in particular, we can see there are many people who support justice in Palestine, irrespective of their religion, irrespective of their race. But of course, Muslims have an added component to their sentiment toward Palestine, which is Jerusalem, which is its first Qibla and its third holiest mosque. So there is of course this religious element in it, and it is important to keep expressing that support and sympathy, because it makes a difference. I mean, imagine if one of the probably main reasons why Trump's move has not been followed by action until now is world reaction. World reaction, by the way, not just at the popular level, governments. Most of the European Union was opposed to this move because it's crazy and it doesn't help and it disrupts all sorts of things. I still remember once we had a big rally in London during the last war, and then afterwards I spoke to Brother Bassem Naim, who was the health minister in Gaza at the time, and he said to me, the next demonstration, I'd like you to tell demonstrators that it means a lot to us when we see them on TV screens expressing support, because we realize we are not alone. And that gives us the impetus, it gives us the encouragement to continue our struggle. So even if it is symbolic, it means a lot in terms of telling the Palestinians who are struggling, you are not alone and we are behind you. But also it brings pressure to bear on governments. I mean, imagine if the Malaysian people here, the public, were indifferent when it came to Palestine. What would the Malaysian government do? They'd probably rush to hug Netanyahu and everybody else. Because these politicians think about interests, about economy, about deals, about projects. They want to be involved in all of this. But because nations have an opinion about issues like this, governments are restricted. I mean, remember, you don't remember, but many of you probably were either very young or were not born yet. I mean, the struggle against apartheid in the 70s and the 80s, I remember very well, and as a student in the UK in the 70s, there were people round the clock in Trafalgar Square protesting against apartheid in South Africa. That was in the 70s. Apartheid came to an end 20 years later. The anti-apartheid movement became a global one, a universal one. Eventually, it pressured governments to reconsider their positions. So we must never belittle whatever NGOs or the public does to express support for just causes. But you are right, we have to be innovative. We have to be to think of new methods, of new ways. Yesterday I had meeting with the group here, BDS group in Malaysia, and actually one of them asked a question, said, because there is not much going on here in Malaysia, sometimes we feel we have to think what to do. But then after the discussion, I reminded them there is actually a lot to do. For instance, these organized trips. I was told yesterday about travel agencies organizing trips to Israel, not to see the Palestinians, but to see how good Israel is. I mean, as a matter of principle, I would encourage a person to go and see how the Palestinians live under occupation. Because if you see that for yourself, then you come back more energetic, more enthusiastic about supporting the Palestinian cause. But if travel agencies organize with the Israeli establishment trips to Palestine, to occupied Palestine, to come back and tell other people that Israel is a great country, that the Palestinians are exaggerating their plight, then this is serving Zionism. And BDS in Malaysia will have to do something about it. And I said to them, your primary target now is the government. The government has to put an end to this, or take charge. It's not against the visits themselves, but why do we go there, and what do we do when we go there? Well, I mean, we in the UK encourage Muslims to go and visit Palestine, but usually these Muslims already have some understanding of what's going on. We provide them with background information. We link them to our relatives and our families in Palestine, so that they go and see how much they suffer because of apartheid Israel. And they come back and they become really more active and more determined. But if it serves the opposite purpose, then we have to do something about it.
You mentioned earlier, Hamas constitution is ripe for change. Can you just perhaps just give us an overview of what direction you think that might take?
Are you asking specifically about the recent document?
Yeah, you were mentioning that Hamas constitution is, I mean, I assume it must be from the time of inception until now there's been no change. Is there an overhaul to this?
No, I spoke about my own critique of Hamas charter.
Yeah.
Because I have a whole chapter in my book criticizing the original charter.
Yeah.
Because the original charter was written in a rush, borders anti-Semitism.
That was from the Muslim Brotherhood time, and
it was published in the summer of 1988, and it relies on conspiracy theory in trying to explain the conflict. There is no conspiracy really. And in my book, I suggest an outline for a new charter. I regret to say that our friends in Hamas came up with a new document last year, or was it the year before? I forgot when. Last year, I think.
It was last year.
Which they think might introduce Hamas in a new image. But I am also critical of this document, because although the discourse has improved a lot, it does not declare the nullification of the charter. The charter has clearly to be cancelled, because the new document considers the charter one of the documents, and this is a new document, and that's a contradiction in terms. If you say something wrong at one time and then you realize that it was wrong, it's not enough to say this is an old document, but it is still a document. Now you have to say it's wrong. Also, because the new document was written under political pressure. A constitution or a charter cannot be written under political pressure from any side. Tony Blair was frequently visiting Khalid Mash'al and told him, if you say something good, if you use a different language, probably the Americans will change their mind, the Europeans, this. Nonsense. Of course, it doesn't work this way. And even that document, nobody pays any attention to anymore. And, events have surpassed it anyway. No, what I would love to see is a proper charter for Hamas that explains the conflict to the world on the basis of historical facts, and that introduces Hamas to the world in a language the world can relate to. This hasn't yet happened.
Would that also mean Hamas including the right to political and armed struggle? Because right now Hamas very much still stands up for armed struggle.
No, armed struggle is a human right
Of course.
for occupied nations. That's not the issue. But the issue is how to justify yourself and your struggle to the world, and to tell the world briefly what is it you want to achieve, etc. This is and the language, the use of language also is important.
I think you have read this book by John Mashiro, the Israeli lobby group and the U.S. foreign policy. I think it states about the strength of this Israeli lobby group, especially in influencing the state's policy, foreign policy, and I think, as far as I can remember, they always vetoed whatever is being, discussed at the United Nations, for example, and I think that that one of the ways to fight this is to form a strong Palestinian lobby group to fight against the Israeli lobby group. What do you think of this idea?
Well, frankly, I don't have much respect for the United Nations. And the reason is the way the United Nations was constructed. It's the most undemocratic institution. How can you have 5 nations with a right to veto the rest of the world? I mean, the General Assembly, whatever the General Assembly decides, means very little. Eventually, it's the Security Council. Now, lobbying is of course a standard now everywhere, but unfortunately, it's a very dirty game. It's a very dirty process. It involves a lot of money, dirty money in many instances. It involves buying and selling favors. And the Arab money is in the hands of, Arab wealth is in dirty hands as well. It's not in clean hands, I regret. Now the Saudi lobby in America and the UAE lobby are fighting Qatar rather than Israel. And are conspiring against Hamas rather than Zionism. If we can do something in these international fora, by all means, I'm not against it. But I think our resources are so restricted and limited that this will continue to be just probably a whimsical notion. I don't think that in the short term or even medium term we can change America. We can change the way the American elite, the American political elite thinks, because the position vis-a-vis Israel is so much entrenched in the American political system. How a congressman becomes a congressman, how a governor becomes a governor, how a president gets the chance to be first nominated and then elected. Christian Zionism in America is so powerful that its lobby is even bigger than the Jewish lobby. This is something that we need not forget. Christian Zionists believe that Israel is a divine project because all the Jews have to go to Palestine before the coming of the Messiah. I mean, the Jews say these are the silly ones, but it's okay. We can make use of we can make use of whatever resources they dedicate to us on the basis of this false belief. But this is a very powerful lobby. The Muslim community in America has tried to do things, has tried to compete, has tried to compete with the Zionist lobby. But it's not really easy. I mean, take the case of our brothers in the Holy Land Foundation. who ended up being imprisoned for 65 years each just for collecting donations for the Palestinians. The judiciary in America is not an independent judiciary, it's highly political, unlike what we see, for instance, in Britain, where the judiciary, I mean, luckily enough, is really independent of direct political pressure. They even, in America, they choose the judge to pave the way for issuing the right sentence as they deem appropriate. So America is really difficult. I'm trying to be realistic about what can be done in America. The media, its power, its influence. Hopefully, if someone like Trump can, because of his bizarre ways, can begin a process whereby the Americans open up their minds and eyes and start seeing the world for what it is, maybe we can hope for a change. But a lobby, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure we are capable of making an influential lobby.
I received phone calls and on Skype as well from professors, a few professors from Australia, who wanted to kind of form this political pressure group among this region, Malaysia, in Australia and Indonesia, and I think that, you know, like, it was like a brilliant idea to push for this political kind of to put political pressure on this kind of settlement. But on the other hand, I understand that you know, like, armed struggle is rights of the Palestinians who are under occupation. But what do you think of this, what I mentioned just now about this proportionate response by the Zionist regime against the Palestinian? Don't you think that, you know, like, it warrants that armed struggle against the Jewish or the Zionist entity?
There is no organized armed struggle against Israel at the moment. At the moment, there is none. There are reactions. I mean, people like, for instance, someone who has grievances because the Israelis did something to him or to his family. They stab a soldier or probably try to steal their weapon and use it. But in Gaza it's different, because in Gaza you have some sort of equilibrium created as a result of the existence of military power in Gaza. Had Hamas not been able to build that military capacity, Israel would have continued to occupy Gaza and do to the Palestinians whatever they wanted. But even when they wage war on Gaza, yes, they destroy much of Gaza, but eventually they themselves suffer, and they beg the Americans and the rest of the world to intervene to stop the war. Armed struggle in itself is a choice, is an option. It would be better not to resort to it if you don't need it. But you cannot rule it out. It will always be there.
You talked about the United Nations. It was actually the United Nations through the resolution of 1947 that created the State of Israel straight after World War II. I think it was the very second day, you know. So, of course, they put into effect what we call the Balfour Declaration. So you have the British who are working together with the Arabs. The Balfour Declaration was shelved for a while, or was just left whilst World War II was taking place. And then you had the UN that came up with that resolution in 1947 that created the State of Israel. And it wasn't just the UN, it was the UN General Assembly that came up with that resolution. So do you want to touch a bit about the creation of the State of Israel?
Well, much of the Arab world at the time were colonies. So when we talk about the Arabs, who were the Arabs? I mean, Egypt was a British colony, Algeria was a French colony, Tunisia was a French colony, Syria was a French colony, Iraq was a British colony. So the whole area was under colonialism. So it was the British doing everything, using probably the names of the Arabs. Yes, and that's another crime that one can attribute to that international body, or sanctioning the creation of a Jewish state on the land of somebody else. You are right. I mean, what they did is implement the Balfour Declaration as it was, nearly. So all they cared about is Jewish rights, but not Palestinian rights, although in passing it is referred to in the Balfour Declaration. Had the Arab neighborhood not been under colonial yoke at the time, Israel would never have come to existence. It's impossible. And that's why many Arabs, ordinary Arabs, from Yemen, from Sudan, from Jordan, from Egypt, from Syria, from Iraq, went to Palestine to prevent Zionism from occupying Palestine. But after they returned, they were put in prison. They were jailed by the Arab governments who were colonial representatives. So the creation of Israel happened at the time when the Arabs had no say, had no freedom, had no independence. And we continue today to suffer from the same thing. I mean, these despotic governments, none of them represent the people. They continue to do things the way the colonial entities did them. And that's why our real struggle is to liberate the Arabs, liberate the Arab human being, because we are all in shackles, all of us. And we need to be liberated in order to take the next step and liberate Palestine.
I'm going to end our discussion today. We had a very lively discussion as well, and thank you everyone. Thank you, Dr. Azzam.
Thank you.
So just for a bit extra information about Dr. Azzam Tamimi's trip here this weekend. Tomorrow we're going to have another talk session in Concord Hotel on tomorrow's the book launch.
Tomorrow is a talk. Public lecture.
Public lecture on the evolution of Muslim Democrat.
No, Islamic political talk.
Islamic political thought, sorry. And there will be another session on Saturday.
Islamists be Democrats.
Can Islamists be Democrat? And also a book launch of a book by Dr. Azzam Tamimi on Rachid Ghannouchi. That one was translated by Islamic Journalism Front and is going to be launched this Saturday. So I think that's all for tonight. We had a very interesting discussion. Once again, thank you, Dr. Azzam Tamimi. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for those who are viewing online. And look forward for next discussions and see you all again. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.